Hi, this is Paul. It's been busy. It's Jordan Peterson wise, it's a super busy time right now because his book just came out. Now, we've been hearing about his book a lot over the last year. He's put together this book in sort of a public way, I think in many ways via the Exodus series, via his tour, which is sort of a pre book tour. Usually people go on tour to sell a book. He sort of goes on tour to write the book. And he's been floating these ideas, he's been putting these ideas out, and now the book is out. I haven't had a chance to read the book yet today. I've been very busy, and I think I'm going to be very busy next week. I might be back making videos from my mother's house next week. But we'll see. We'll see. It's going to be a busy November and December, and it's been busy at Livingstone's for a whole variety of things. Now, I'm not going to talk about the book yet because I haven't read it yet, but hopefully I'll get into that. I've got 3 or 4 other things on my mind. But he did this thing on Sunday with Ben Shapiro, and actually, I thought this was one of his ideas have sort of come together. The book is written. He not only wrote the book, and of course the process of writing the book, you proofread the book, and he's talked about the fact that I've sort of known that there's kind of 2 kinds of people. There's kind of vomiters and editors. And usually the process of writing, you put something on a page, and then some people just keep vomiting until they get it right and they're happy with it, do a little bit of editing and go. Some people vomit it on the page and edit and edit and edit and edit and edit. When he talks about maps of meaning, that seems to be the kind of writer he is. So he has been working on these ideas and digesting these ideas and trying to get these ideas right for a very long time. And I actually thought that his presentation I've got that's the Greg Lowry conversation. His conversation with Ben Shapiro, he had some long strings of when he was pretty much talking and laying out his ideas. And I think, again, his ideas have continued to coalesce. Now, somebody who has gotten the book the first day has been writing me about his impressions of the book. And, part of his critique is that Peterson is building a system within his own system. And that's true. And so when we get to talk about the Greg Laurie video, we're going to talk about that because that was an excellent example of 2 people living in 2 different worlds. But I think in some ways this nicely sets up then the conversation with Greg Laurie. I don't know if it's Lowry or Laurie or whatever it is, but let's jump into this section of the Ben Shapiro show here. I mean, this is a long period where, let's see if they didn't do chapters. This is a long period in the conversation where Peterson sort of lets out, this is the way he is currently fitting together what religion is. Now, we're going to continue talking about that word because especially when we get into the Greg Laurie video, we'll have to talk about that word. But let's go.
You have to stay within the realm of the symbolic representations in order for the portrayal to make sense. And I think
Okay, he just finished a section on large language models. Again, he's been putting out a lot of content lately, and so he's been, again, putting these out and refining them and sort of getting them tighter and tighter. But again, part of this is he talked about this with Jonathan Peugeot. I would really love to go back to that video. Things are just sort of coming up on me from behind now, so I have to try and stay ahead of it. But that's what he's talking about with respect to large language models. And I thought a lot of the comments on that last video that I did of his conversation with Peugeot were very helpful. So he's trying to get a justification for why symbolism works and why symbolism is reliable enough to draw relationships in the world between what seem to be disconnected events.
I asked one of the world's top neuroscientists flat out, can I remember his name off the top of my head? Anyways, it'll come to me. I asked him if every perception was a micro-narrative, and he said yes. Right, and so that's very interesting. This is
and part of, so as Peterson is getting this stuff worked out, sort of like maps of meaning, it's getting denser and denser and denser and denser. So what on earth do you mean by a micro narrative? Basically, what he does is brings in the fact that there's I've played that bit from Local Distance, where there's sort of the foreground and the background, and the things up front and the network behind it. Well, what we're putting together here is that things make sense within a narrative. And one way to think about that is, very early on, I had conversations with John Vervaeke, and we were talking about narrative, and he made the point that a big part of what we do after we reach a certain age and a certain capacity is to develop an autobiography. And he made the point that this isn't, well, that word natural is so complex. This is a capacity that we learn over time. This is a capacity that is fundamental to our sense making. This is a capacity that, let's say, if someone is struggling with schizophrenia or dementia, that they lose. The idea is that we sort of keep a map or a constant autobiography. Now it sort of pauses and sleep cycles and back and forth, in and out, in and out. We sort of keep this autobiography, and that's a narrative. That's a story we tell ourselves about. And the point that Peterson is making is that our perceptions have everything to do with that narrative. And again, if you pay careful attention to people, you can see this in operation. You can have two people in a room observing what seems to be the same situation, but they come out of the room with very different stories. One person might say, they've just insulted me. The other person might say, they didn't insult you, they complimented you. Well, usually it's on the basis of the stories that they are bringing to what's happening in the room that not only impacts their interpretation of the room, that's sort of the older way of thinking about it. It even interprets what they see in the room. And we've been making this point for a very long time. If I walk into my messy office, I will see what I'm looking for. Now, if something is strange, like there's a Bengal tiger or there's the King of England, I used to use the Queen, but now there's a king. The King of England is sitting in my office. I will immediately go to them. But again, if you pay very close attention to your conscious perception of the world, you will see that the narrative that you have and the interests that you bring to the world will very much shape the world you see, that goes even more fundamental than just interpretation.
This is revolutionary because, of course, the atheist reductionist materialists like Dawkins assume that there is a self-evident fact level somewhere and that you can...
Right. They assume that the world is flat. You simply apprehend all of the data and then you interpret the data. But the point that Peterson is making is we now know you cannot apprehend all the data. And so the point of conscious interpretation and even unconscious interpretations happens even after the pre-conscious selections have been made that have everything to do with the story within you and a whole bunch of pre-conscious things. This is not a debate within psychology or cognitive science. And the more you think about it, and once you see this truth and begin to walk around with it, it itself becomes fairly clear that this ability that we have to see and engage and perceive the world is a very complex thing that we bring a lot to it. John Vervaeke again talks about this as being transjective.
Reduce everything that's value predicated to this level of incontrovertible self-evident fact. That level doesn't exist. It's interpretation all the way down. Now, the weird thing about that is that, in a sense, that's what the postmodernists have been claiming. But what they got wrong was that interpretation level itself, the weighting level, also has a structure. And one of the things I try...
And again, he's going so fast here because he sort of like maps of meaning. If you read that very tortured book, it's very compressed. This is what Jordan does. Jordan has all of this stuff out here, and he hones and he hones and he reduces and he reduces and he gets it tighter and tighter and gets it to small and small enough packages so that he can get more and more packages sort of next to each other so he can try and process as much of the world as possible. That's what he's doing here. So, what did he just say?
Tried to tell but what they got wrong was that interpretation level itself, the weighting level, also has a structure.
Okay, the structure piece is critical because this is exactly what he's been after. Because the postmodernists basically said, and it's not, again, it's not a bad thing that, well, our reasoning is motivated. Okay, our reasoning is motivated. And therefore, whether it's power or pure self-interest or using power to achieve what is in our self-interest, basically the postmodernists said we are slaves to using our power to achieve our self-interest. And Peterson says, wait a minute. If that were true, the world would look very different. There is actually a structure that we are beholden to, that we are accountable to, that can account for the shape of flourishing human beings. There is a structure, and the better we understand this structure, the better we will see and be able to account for the world the way that it is. And basically what he's going to say is what the religious traditions, especially Christianity in his opinion and in mine, you can understand how these religions, the place these religions have by looking at this structure. In other words, religions are not just certain just so motivated stories that we project onto the world. If we dig deep enough into the world to account for what we are seeing in terms of not the complete collapse of the world because of human self-interest, there is something there, and that can give you clues into the structure of the universe.
And one of the things I tried to tell Dawkins was that that's the structure of the meme world. That's a good way of thinking about it. Like the world that we've abstracted up in linguistic representation and imagination, it has a structure. That's the Jungian collective unconscious. And that's the consequence of the competition between memes across.
Okay, so we had this conversation with Dawkins. Again, you can look at Brett Weinstein's conversation with a dude with a ponytail. See? What do I notice about the dude? He's got big muscles and a ponytail. Is he a Peugeotian gym bro? I don't know. He has a podcast and Brett was on it. But Brett sort of nicely laid out the fact of memes as extended phenotype, and Brett sort of laid out religion as extended phenotype in terms of how we deal with the world. But Peterson pulls back and says, hey, wait a minute. If these things are going to be functional at all, there must be something in the world that makes these things function. So in other words, one of the things that happens, Peugeot made the point in his Patreon video with respect to the Dawkins conversation. Physicists, biologists sort of assume things like laws of physics or laws of nature, which they cannot account for. These are presuppositional. These are, Peugeot likened it to the virgin birth. These are just the structure that is there in order to virginally birth this world, the laws of physics, the laws of nature, all of these things. And for a long time, Christians have basically been saying, well, this is an argument for the existence of God. And these cosmological arguments go back many, many centuries. Now, psychology is a very young discipline. And so what happens with psychology and what Jordan is doing is they're saying, not only are there laws of nature, there are laws of consciousness, apprehension, and all of the things that are fundamental to human flourishing in the world. There is a structure there. Now, my friend Glenn Scrivener recently did a video, what Jordan Peterson gets wrong about sacrifice. And Glenn, Glenn, I think, rightly sees what I've seen for a long time. Peterson sort of has a Augustinian anthropology and a Pelagian soteriology. And whereas the previous videos that I've made about Jordan Peterson recently have talked about a stairway to heaven, where Jordan is sort of ascending a stairway and sort of meets God coming down, he talks about Jordan sort of digging down into rationality to find God. Now, I really don't disagree with anything that Glenn says here in terms of what Jordan is doing. I think we're on the same page. I perhaps the valence of the project, I'm more appreciative than Glenn is. Because I think actually the project is an apologetic project, not unlike Christian apologists that would work the cosmological argument or the ontological argument. I think Jordan is, instead of already being a Christian who is trying to convince other people about the realities of divine revelation, in other words, conversion coming from above. Now, I'm a Calvinist, which means I very much believe that conversion comes from above. I very much believe that conversion and quickening is God's work. Now, that doesn't mean that things don't actually also come up from below. But I think in many ways, Jordan's case, as let's say compared to his wife and his daughter, who seem to both have taken a certain leap of faith, and I talked about these in my videos, Jordan is sticking to the stairway. And many of us Christians don't believe the stairway built from the ground goes all the way up, that in fact God brings a stairway coming down, and that stairway is, of course, Jesus Christ. But even so, it is, again, I'm a Calvinist, so it's all by grace. I'm not going to get into the complexities of the Calvinist Arminian conversation. I think in many ways, a lot of those fights that have happened in past centuries are themselves captive to certain Enlightenment paradigms. Anyway, Jordan is very much working from the ground up, building his staircase to heaven. And instead of looking at something like the cosmological argument, he is putting together a psychological consciousness, a cognitive argument for the existence of God. Now, again, unlike Christian apologists who sort of stand on the opposite shore calling people to jump, Jordan is on his stairway calling people to follow. And I think that is exactly what's been happening. And as in that one video that Rationality Rules made about Destiny's observation, Rationality Rules and Destiny agreed that Jordan doesn't leap with them. Jordan just keeps building the stairway to heaven, but then other people follow him and then they jump. And so I don't have a big argument with what Jordan has done, because he's just helping people climb his stairway and then make the leap, which for a lot of people is a shorter leap.
Hundreds of thousands of years. And so one of the reasons I really wanted to talk to Richard Dawkins and
I don't know. I saw Ben Shapiro do this setup with Peugeot on the TV screen too. It's a choice by the producers that they think this looks good. I think it looks funny. And I remember when Rebel Wisdom was doing like the people in like this old MacBook Air. So I don't know, but what do I know?
And I had spoken with Brett Weinstein in some detail before that, was that Dawkins' meme idea is way more significant than he thinks. But he won't take that step, because if he steps beyond, like he said, a meme is a backwards baseball cap. It's like,
so in other words, Dawkins won't even take the step onto Jordan Peterson's stairway to heaven. And everybody's angry with Jordan because he won't take the step over the gap beyond the stairway to heaven.
Like, Jesus, Richard, really? I mean, come on, give yourself some credit. You're talking about the manner in which abstract representations war for supremacy in the space defined by abstract human cognition. You can do better than backwards baseball cap.
So Peterson basically expresses, Dawkins, you deserve some credit for the Jordan Peterson consciousness argument for the existence of God, but you won't even climb my staircase.
I tried to let him know that Mircea Eliade, who's a great historian of religion, has mapped out something like the structure of the war between gods in heaven across multiple cultures. And it's a very stable pattern. You get a polytheistic interpretation of the world, which is something like the narrative embodiment of different value structures, and then they vie for supremacy. And that probably happens as isolated tribal groups come together in larger civilizations. So there's actual war on the ground, but there's also conceptual war in the space of imagination. And then that tends towards the emergence of a monotheism across time if the culture manages to unite itself. And then that monotheism has certain properties. Like in Mesopotamia, for example, a god named Marduk rose up out of the polytheistic,
And again, these are arguments that he's been making all the way back to the Genesis series in 2017, which set up 12 Rules for Life. Now, I also think that I have a laundry list of stuff to talk with Jordan about, and one of them is evolutionary monotheism versus revolutionary polytheism. There's another good still. All right, let's keep going.
the realm of polytheistic combat. And Marduk was characterized by eyes all the way around his head, so attention, and by the capacity to speak magic words, the words that transform night into day, which is very similar to the conception of Yahweh at the beginning of time. But there's a reason for that. It's that as these underlying value structures vie for supremacy, what emerges as superordinate and stable is structured. And I think the reason for that, Ben, is that...
Now, again, it's a Darwinian argument for the existence of God. And the moment that was so interesting in the Dawkins conversation was when Dawkins sort of caught that, but Alex sort of sent the conversation in another direction. And it was really a lost opportunity because it was at that point in the conversation that they seemed to find each other. And, you know, if you sort of are keeping an eye on the big picture, and if the goal is for Peterson and Dawkins to kind of find each other in the conversation, don't interrupt that moment.
That imagine that you took the set of all possible playable games and you extracted out what playable meant. Playable would mean something like infinitely iterable, improving as you played it, and voluntarily chosen. Well,
again, this is another idea that he's had since his original biblical series.
Very tight set of constraints around what would constitute an acceptable game. And there's no reason to assume that wouldn't reemerge continually as the world of playable games battled, what would you say, as battles raged in the world of potentially playable games. It makes perfect sense. And Dawkins kind of got excited about that idea near the end of our discussion because we talked about how that might function biologically, right? So once you establish a story as supreme, then people can compete within that framework for reproductive supremacy.
And again, this was the Baldwin effect. The Baldwin effect is an evolutionary theory proposed by psychologist James Mark Baldwin in the late 19th century. It describes how learned behaviors, which are not genetically inherited, can indirectly influence evolution. Here's how it works. Learning and adaptation. When an organism encounters a new environment or challenge, it may adapt through learned behaviors rather than through genetic change to better survive and reproduce. And again, this is sort of the meme theory underway. For example, animals might learn to exploit a new food source or avoid predators through experience rather than instinct. Natural selection of learning abilities. Over time, individuals that can learn these beneficial behaviors may survive and reproduce more than those that cannot. Thus, the ability to learn these behaviors is favored by natural selection. Genetic assimilation. Eventually, if a behavior is consistently advantageous, it may lead to genetic change. Offspring with genes that make them more likely to exhibit or easily learn the beneficial behaviors will have an advantage. Over generations, This can lead to a behavior becoming instinctual rather than learned as genes that support it become more common. The Baldwin effect suggests that while behaviors learned through an organism's lifetime aren't directly inherited, the ability to learn or be predisposed to certain behaviors can directly influence evolutionary paths.
That would mean that the reproductive victory would confer an advantage on the genes that matched that story. So that's how biological evolution can chase the structure of narrative. Well, Dawkins, he figured that when we talked about that, this was only the last half an hour or so, he saw how that might work, which I thought was, well, I couldn't have asked for a better end to our discussion than that. It's like, that's also an explanation for the emergence of the Jungian collective unconscious, right at the from the genetic level all the way up to the conceptual. I think it's indisputable that these sorts of things have occurred. It can't not be the case. It has to be the case. And I think it has to be the case biologically. Once human beings opened up the capacity for abstraction and we created worlds of representation in abstraction, then the fact of the existence of those worlds is going to start to have a determining effect on the course of biological evolution.
Okay, now, those worlds of abstraction are competing. They're not distinct like in separate containers or silos. There's plenty of interaction between them. There's code switching and code swapping within them. It's a hugely messy enterprise. You have to keep that in mind when we get into the next conversation with Greg. Is it Greg? I think it's Greg. You know, he's been doing. It's so interesting. Yeah, Greg. You have to keep that in mind because part of when we get to that Greg Laurie conversation, you're going to have to ask questions about. So actually, I saw it. It got posted. I didn't have any time yesterday. I went to Costco. I had to do grocery shopping, and then we didn't have a lot of food in my house. So my wife says, "Hey, bring me one of those Costco hot dogs." And so they do that, and you get the hot dog, and then they also give you the soda cup. It's like, maybe I'll have a little soda. But it was like already 7 or 8 at night, and I, for the most part, avoid caffeine just because when I want to use caffeine, like if I'm on a road trip and I want to stay awake. So if you use caffeine all the time, it doesn't have much effect on you, so I avoid it. But I thought, I kind of feel like a soda, so I had some caffeine, and so then my wife at a certain hour is getting sleepy. She's like, I'm going to bed. It's like, okay. So then my wife went to bed, and then I thought, let's check out the Jordan Peterson, Greg Laurie conversation. And that started out, and one of my sons was sitting next to me, and I said, it's going to take these two guys a while to find each other because Jordan is a famous talker, and he's excited to talk to him. And Jordan is like, he's got all these things he wants to tell you and share. But a guy like Greg Laurie, he's incredibly busy. He probably had heard the name Jordan Peterson. And so when he got the invitation, he's like, sure. But Greg Laurie probably hasn't watched hardly any of Jordan Peterson, hasn't sort of gone through to sort of take all these tightly packed ideas and separate them a little bit to understand them. So Jordan's just going on and on and on. And Greg Laurie's like, I've never been to a therapist or taken any psychology. So you're like my first one. And then Jordan just dumps a whole load of everything that Jordan's been working on. It's like, what do you think about that? And for even the first question, Jordan asks him a fairly straightforward first question. And Greg goes into like this little mini sermonette that doesn't have a lot to do with the question. He could have just answered the question, say, no, I don't see a lot of young men coming into my local church. But then again, Greg Laurie is in a position now where for many years now, he's been traveling around doing these like Billy Graham style crusades. And he has this big organization that he runs. And so from his point of view, he probably doesn't see a lot of, let's say, what Jonathan Peugeot sees or a bunch of orthobros sees in terms of Orthodox guys coming into the church. So he couldn't answer the question, so he just gave a little sermonette. And then Jordan Peterson dumps a whole bunch more stuff on him. And then Greg Laurie gives him another sermonette. And the conversation really doesn't start to get going until Greg Laurie starts telling his story. And then Jordan sort of switches into inquisitive therapist mode and begins to sort of help draw out Greg's story and do some interpretation of it. And that's when the conversation gets better. Anyway, we'll get there soon.
The alternative hypothesis is that the fact that human beings can think is independent of their reproductive status and their biology. That's a stupid theory. Obviously, that's not true. So I think we're in a revolution, a conceptual revolution, Ben, and I think all the
And I think he's right. I think we are in a conceptual revolution, and it's happening around us. It's just that these things take time.
this political drama, all the culture war is a reflection of something much deeper going on underneath the surface. Everyone has that feeling anyways, you know.
Yeah, I think that's right. And you're seeing competing stories, as you say, being told in the political sphere that really are just happening at the top of the iceberg. There's a much bigger story that's happening much deeper. Jordan, one of the questions that you get asked a lot is about your own personal view of God, because you've talked about, what you think of religion in terms of sort of...
Now we're going to get into this question that has been getting thrown out and thrown around for 7 years. Part of the difficulty of this, if you understand how presuppositions work, is that you can't hear someone say the word God and not have a deeply implicit definition of what that person is meaning. And this goes all the way back to what I saw when I saw Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris in their first conversation on stage in Vancouver, and I began to recognize that Jordan Peterson was building a stairway to heaven from the ground up, and that in many ways that biblically could sort of be seen as God number one, God through general revelation, an arenic God. Now, the God of revelation, the God of special revelation, an agentic God in the way that we tend to, the majority way in which we talk with the presumption of agency is what I call God number two. But again, and one of the insights I had when I was watching this video was the feature bug, two sides of the same coin with tribalisms. Now, what tribalisms are super compressed, fast decision makers, sort of like identities. So I am this, I am not this, I am this, I am not this. And we have this whole series of instinctual reactions based on our identity, based on our tribe. We see this in politics. We see it in religion. And so what we do then is, because, again, the world is too complex. We were just talking about that. John Vervaeke talks about combinatorial explosiveness. Because the world is so complex, we need filters to quickly knock down most of what we see so that we don't pay any attention to it. And all of that filtering is going on pre-consciously. We're just doing it. And these things are experiential to us, usually in emotional reactions and biases. And so when I think about what my friend Glenn Scrivener is doing, he is sort of expressing the tribal biases of Team Christian. And of course, Team Christian gets broken down into all kinds of different teams within Christianity. And, at this level, we might be sort of Team Christian, but at this level, we might be Team Evangelical. At this level, we might be Team Reformed. At this level, we might be Team Christian Reformed. At this level, we might be Team thumbs up or thumb downs on Human Sexuality Report. On this level, we might be Team thumbs up or thumb down on the Gravamen. We just have all of these little switches in us that, depending on the context, depending on the arena, we sort of deal with. And that's why you can have people who are complete in a tiny minutia group in, let's say, a specific religion, that thing goes all the way up where they can, of course, Monty Python touched on this in the sketch, they can be sworn enemies of someone way down there in their group, but be aligned with people who don't believe anything like them, depending on a different context and a different group because of how this goes. So Peterson's about to complain about this tribal dynamic, but in many ways you can see how this tribal dynamic is part of this whole system that we are now starting to see thanks to cognitive science. That, in fact, we must have these tribal circuit breakers in order to, I'm going to stop paying attention to this, I'm going to pay attention to that. I'm going to stop paying attention to this, I'm going to pay attention to that. And again, this just goes click, 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 and we don't even feel the clicks. We just feel someone saying something, and it's like, okay, well, Jordan Peterson keeps talking about the Bible, must be Team Christian. But then when we get to belief in God, he's not saying believe with your eyes and profess with your mouth. He's not saying the secret magic words that the Bible has. So no. So a breaker trips down here, even though it was left open up there. And so that, on one hand, it's a frustrating thing because we want to be liked, we want to be welcomed, we want to be agreed with, we want our ideas to just flow through everybody's system of circuit breakers, but they don't. And so it's like, well, he'll voice the complaint. He'll voice the complaint directly.
Useful truth or utilitarian truth about that you get asked a lot is about your own personal view of God, because you've talked about what you think of religion in terms of sort of useful truth or utilitarian truth or various types of truth. And once again, the accusation is, well, you're avoiding the question of like factual truth. You factually believe that God exists. Are you trying to end around that question?
And again, as there's a teaser with this, where basically Peterson rightly notes, as many apologists over the years have noted, that God is not just one other thing in the world like this lens cap. That is, when we're using that word, that's not what we mean. But many, many Christians and many, many non-Christians, in terms of all of these circuit breakers, that's the roughest draft thing. And so, as I talked about in videos 6-7 years ago, part of what happened in the history of culture is that this God number one, which is Arenic, sort of got dropped off because deism sort of filled out the world in an impersonal way. And in some ways, this went back to what Ezekiel Kaufman talked about as the meta-divine realm. And then the only kind of God that we could imagine was God number two. And that then would get caricatured like a super thing in the sky.
Obviously, we've seen a number of high-profile conversions in the recent pastor wife became a recent convert to the Catholic Church. What do you make of that question, and how do you answer it?
My answer to that always is, I act as if God exists, and people don't like that because they say, well, what do you believe? What do you think is true? It's like, well, it's perfectly reasonable to have a debate about what constitutes the basis of faith. As far as I'm concerned, and it's an existential claim, what you believe to be true is what you stake your life on.
And I think that's a great definition. The follow-up questions, though, are what do we mean by staking your life on? Because, again, now we're sort of in the realm of preacherhood here, because this is always what preachers are always sort of exhorting their congregations to greater faith, even though what the preachers don't want people to do is, go out on, well, how exactly would you test what you're staking your life on? Now, John Calvin, in his commentary to the book of Daniel, has a funny little statement that basically says, to the degree that you worry, you doubt God. And I'll often point out to people that in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus has a direct command, do not worry. Do not worry about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink. Now, so one could say that fits really nicely with what Peterson just said. And so you can say, well, do you worry? If you worry, you don't have a lot of faith. And of course, Jesus again and again in the Gospels says to his disciples, oh, you of little faith. So
it's what you act out. And it isn't, see, I think that's really a hangover in some ways from a Protestant view of belief. And I'm not trying to single the Protestants out here.
He isn't, and he's right. I'm not going to get defensive about the word. Anybody who's watched my channel long enough knows I have plenty of critiques for my own tribe. Anyone who is part of a tribe will probably have enormous critiques of their own tribe, and also should be willing to share them, just in terms of that's how we have productive conversations with people from other tribes. The Protestant thing has to do with the history of ideas, the rise of modernity, the Protestant Enlightenment, and a particular approach to reality. And that is a huge, complex philosophical path to try to draw.
The Protestants did more than anyone else, arguably, although you got to give credit to the Jews on this front too, to bring literacy to the world, right? It was the combination of the printing press and the Protestant insistence that everyone could have direct contact with the Word of God that made the whole world literate. And that is not an overstatement. That
is not an overstatement. Peterson is absolutely right there.
Historical fact. But the problem with the Protestant approach, in some ways, because it's so hyperlinguistic, is that belief gets transformed into something like the willingness to mouth a set of propositions.
Again, exactly right. That is exactly right.
And I just don't think, that's true in a way, but it's not fundamentally true. And Christ himself says in the Gospels that not everyone who says, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. Like the mere verbal assent to a statement of belief is not sufficient to bring.
And again, parable of two sons. Father told his sons, go do this. One said he would and then didn't, and one said no, but then did. Which one obeys the father? Well, it's a simple parable. It's a simple answer. But the fact that Jesus had to make that parable shows that while this gets accentuated for historical, philosophical, developmental reasons during the Protestant period, it's an issue throughout the history of humanity.
Bring the kingdom of heaven to earth. It's a matter of commitment and action. It's a matter of verbal assent to a statement of belief is not sufficient to bring the kingdom of heaven to earth.
I don't know if we'll get that far in the Laurie video, but as Peterson continues to sort of build his stairway to heaven, and how he sort of built a stairway up to a place where he's hanging out with Protestants and Catholics and Orthodox, some of these theological questions about, well, exactly what is the relationship between the kingdom of God and the kingdom of heaven in this current dispensation? How does human activity or agency involve in that? Christians have been having debates over this for a very, very long time, I'd say all the way to beginning. And in fact, I would argue that those debates go all the way throughout the entire biblical corpus. And Jesus, in fact, I think, makes some important turns in there, and this sort of has become a lot of the conversations that I've had with some of my Jewish friends in the corner, and this also has to do with questions of religion and politics, a lot there.
It's a matter of commitment and action. It's a matter of actual sacrifice. And then I would say to people,
commitment and action and sacrifice, yes. But this is where sort of the nature of the stairway to heaven and the nature of grace begin to come into play. And so in the Glenn Laurie conversation, basically Glenn Laurie talks about the fact that his mother had serial relationships with men. And at one point, one of the men, probably one of the best, Oscar Laurie, adopted Greg as his son. But then when Oscar Laurie and his mother split up, back in those days, the mother easily won the custody fight. So Greg had to continue to live in the chaos of his mother. That was deeply formative to the desperation that young Greg Laurie had when he met Lonnie Frisbee, and probably deeply formative to the way in which Greg Laurie embraced Chuck Smith and Lonnie Frisbee and this incredible movement that was happening in Southern California at this point in time. So Greg looks back on it and says, would it have been better if I had been raised by Oscar Laurie instead of in the chaos of my mother? Yes. But I believe God had a plan for me, and that plan was worked out in that chaos. Now, it's exactly at a juncture like this that everything gets tricky for people. If you look at Nathan Jacobs and the work that he's done on the rise of the nuns, Nones. If you're pastorally talking to people who are processing a disaster in their life, many religious people will make the move and say, and it's a valid biblical move, Joseph basically makes it in the book of Genesis. The people that did this either did it ignorantly or meant it for good, or meant it for evil, and God meant it for good. Right away, you get that agentic God, that God number 2 coming in. And that then poses all sorts of trust issues for us. Now, again, in terms of how the Bible talks about our problem, trust is key. You go all the way back to that story in the garden. Fundamentally, the man and the woman do not trust that God isn't holding out on them. And so they grab the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Trust, pistis, is the same word as faith and believe in the New Testament. So all of these ideas come together. And part of what, so let's listen to this again.
Who have no mere verbal assent to a statement of belief is not sufficient to bring the kingdom of heaven to earth. It's a matter of commitment and action. It's a matter of action.
It's a matter of commitment and action. The question is, where do your motivations come from? Where does your capacity to respond come from? Because the more we learn about psychology, for example, the more you know that, well, on one hand, many people have a higher capacity for trust in institutions, trust in the goodwill of others, trust in all sorts of things that will help them go further, and others don't. And so, again, for me, I remain a Calvinist, and part of what Calvinists do right in this little area of interchange is they punt. And they punt over in the direction of God. Now, that makes good sense if you have a God number 1 and a God number 2, because you don't try to overly separate what's been happening through so-called natural development causes or history and what is coming in from above. And if you want to read a treatment of this, how C.S. Lewis wrestles on putting this together, read his book Miracles, because in many ways that's what that book is about. Lewis says we have it from on bottom, but you can't really say it doesn't come on top. Basically, revelation is omitted because of the scientific lab link, because in the Enlightenment we said, wow, we can learn a lot about the world if we stick to these rules. And one of those rules is no fudging with God made it happen in the laboratory. And that's a fine rule in the laboratory. But that rule in the laboratory is sort of like perhaps a little virus in a certain place in a country that, well, I don't want to bias any of the listeners, but it's a lab leak. This little rule that is important in the laboratory gets out into the wild, and people apply it to everything, to the point that we have what Charles Taylor calls buffered selves. And again, and this is where I agree with Glenn Scrivener, Jordan is sort of building a stairway from the bottom. And what that means is Jordan's stories of salvation will very much be oriented around human effort. But what Christians have long known is there is so much more to where we are in the world than human effort. Jordan didn't choose the time of his birth. Jordan didn't choose the genetics that came to become him. Jordan didn't choose the community that formed him, very interesting community in northern Alberta. Jordan didn't choose a thing. Jordan didn't choose that his wife would get deathly ill. Jordan didn't choose that he himself would be deathly ill. Yet the illness of his wife and her miraculous recovery and Jordan's ability to survive, and now with this crazy diet of just eating meat, Jordan didn't choose any of that. Now, does that mean that Jordan can't be given credit for a lot of what he's learned? Of course he can and should. But the difficulty is that all of that is embedded in a world that Jordan can't take credit for. So these kinds, the math is so complex on these kinds of problems that in the end you have to fudge. And basically what Calvinists do is we always fudge in favor of God and say, well, that's God's work. God's work from below, God's work from above. God number one, God number two. But it's all God.
Actual sacrifice. And then I would say to people who want to know what I believe is, well, first of all, it's not like I'm hiding anything. Here's a book. It explains what I believe. That's why I wrote the book. And it's one of 4 books. And all of those books are my attempts to make what I believe to be the case as clear as possible. And people seem to assume that there's some secret hidden underneath that. Maybe there is, but if there is, I don't know what the hell it is. But it's even more like look, I get trolled online a fair bit, as you do, no doubt, and of course. And the worst trolls are 2 types. The atheistic reductionist materialists, they're Luciferian beyond belief. And every time I interview a scientist, the Simpsons comic book guys come out from underneath their rocks and whine about how the fact that they're smart hasn't made them king of the world in their bitter and resentful troll demon epithets. And the other ones are the Christian fundamentalists, and like they're equally intolerable. Peterson's almost there. It's like, well, hey, great, glad you think so. What have you done lately?
We'll get to more with Jordan in just a moment. First, folks.
Oh, and there's the ad. Up. Collars and Co.
These questions is really that,
Maybe he went on for another. I want to hear the rest of that rant. Is there more to that rant? I want to hear it. But this point is fair, But again, back to the point I made about these tribal circuit breakers. They're frustrating. I get it. I totally get it. And believe me, I've been living in that world far longer than Jordan has because I live in it all the time. And, fights within churches, fights within denominations, fights within theological systems, fights between clergy, all have to do with all of these circuit breakers, because the truth is, even if Jordan stepped out and said, I believe in God, and quoted the Bible, that they're going to have another question for him. Well, is it a triune God or not? What do you think about the divinity of Christ? What do you think about the Trinity? So now he's got the Muslims and the Jews and the Christian Unitarians on one side, and so these things just go all the way down. And again, I know they're frustrating, but they sort of get into that feature bug thing because they have to be there because of combinatorial explosiveness. We have to organize the world. So on one hand, they'll say, woohoo, Jordan's one of us. And then he turns and says something and said, oh no, Jordan's not one of us because his God is or isn't a triune God. His God Where does he stand on human agency? Is his theology too Pelagian, or is his theological anthropology too Augustinian? On and on and on and on and on, and you can argue like this forever. So then he talks to Greg Laurie, and again, I watched the Jesus Revolution movie. I made a couple of videos about it after I'd watched the movie. Not surprised Jordan is here. Jordan has a woman's approach to finding sources of conversation. He lets the hierarchies do the sorting, and he peels them off the top. And so he obviously saw the Jesus Revolution movie, wants to get into it with Greg Laurie. For the first part of this conversation, they can't find each other. And it's sort of frustrating. But again, back to the point I made earlier in this video, it illustrates what Jordan said, in that we live in these conceptually mapped separate worlds. Now, there's enough. They're both speaking English. They're both, okay, got to play it.
Say, remember when we had eloquent politicians who could say things intelligently and make good points? Remember that? We used to have those.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm going to make a video about this because I've had some thoughts about it lately, listening to The Rest is History's treatment of 1968. Yeah.
We used to have men who would read the Saturday Review of Literature and quote Archibald MacLeish when they were discussing things with NASA.
Yeah. We still have those
that.
men. We just don't send them to the House.
No, or the Congress.
Or maybe they're smart enough not to go.
They're on YouTube and TikTok.
Oh.
He's right there. He sees it. He sees the problem.
Yeah.
It's already beginning to show up. And so what he's seeing is, so Searle talks about the background, the network, and the network of intentionality is all the ideas, all of your intentional conscious content, right? Everything that's about something, dreams, visions, ideas, thoughts, goals, all the artifacts of consciousness, the things that furnish your conscious world and your ideas. That's right. Intentionality just means ofness or aboutness. So anytime you have a thought of something or about something, that's intentionality.
Yep.
And he's saying you have a network of intentionality, all of these intentional bits of intentionality of knowing things and feeling things and having thoughts about things and imagination, and all of that forms a network of intentionality. And that gets meaning up against a background. And the background is a set of capacities, things like knowing a language, having a prefrontal cortex, being able to see, having senses, the capacity to use language, the ability to think. And the background, and he says this in his book on perception, he says there's no hard and fast line between the background and the network. Just like there's no hard and fast line between a tree and its roots. They kind of bleed into each other.
Right.
And what's happened is that the larger background, when you have a shared background, your network of intentionality, you can use the network of intentionality to get clarity and to have meaning and to communicate.
Yep.
But when the background isn't shared, because meaning occurs in a network against a background, when the background isn't shared, then it's hard to create shared meaning.
Okay. So part of what happens with Greg Laurie is that part of their background is shared, part of their network is shared, but just like the tree and its roots, the background and the network, it's sort of hard to see where one stops and the other begins. And the same thing in terms of between the two people. And so when they start the conversation, they're a ways off from each other. Now, again, this is part of the reason why, for me, you're better off building a network of lower status people that you have more access to than just always trying to climb a ladder to get around higher status people. Why is that? You don't have very much access to them. They're terribly busy. There's a tremendous amount of competition for them. if you really want to make progress knowing the world, map each other's backgrounds as much as you can, connect each other's networks as much as you can. And as that pushes against the world, you begin to learn the world more. Peterson, again, also talks about the fact, reality is this thing that we bump up against, and it's painful often. And the pain is a signal that we have bumped into something real. Now, again, this word religion, this word real, these are things that are, these are words whose definitions, whose deep definitions are changing all around us. We're living through that time when the discussion of what do we mean by real and what do we mean by religion is changing deeply. So Peterson talking to Laurie, both of them are very high status men. And again, this is part of there's a wisdom to Peterson's approach to peeling people off the top. And there's a liability to it, just like just about everything else. There's always these trade-offs. The wisdom is you'll find someone that, really has done some quite remarkable things. The liability is you don't even know how much background you share. And just from the outset, these two have been running in very different circles. Someone like Greg Laurie has been spending his life working on ways to articulate the story within his worldview again and again and again and again. As a preacher, what you tend to do is you tend to do a lot of repetition. You reinforce the story through repetition. And religious communities very much have, especially conservative religious communities, have very little openness towards different framings of their stories. Part of the way they construct a world, I think, you can read Tanya Lerman about how to make God real. Part of the way you construct a world is you create a community of people who are very tight-knit, very close together, see the world the same way. And in each individual, that's how you will believe more and more. And that's in many ways how you will begin to try to have your actions and your beliefs more in sync. Remember earlier Peterson was talking about actions and beliefs. This is how they will get in sync if you have a tight-knit group of people who believe very similar things. The problem is in such a group you can have tremendous self-deception. I mean, sometimes there's a rather crude way of talking about that. They can call it a circle jerk because everybody's just reinforcing each other. But then of course all these different clumps of people are all doing this. And then when these clumps of people bump into each other and compete with each other, the idea is that a group that has a better handle on not just, let's say, the laws of physics or the laws of nature, but let's say the laws of consciousness and the structures beneath it will over time outcompete with others. That's why this is sort of a Darwinian consciousness competition. And so then as groups realize this, they begin to realize, and again, Peterson's talked about all of these dynamics in the past, and so has McGilchrist. So McGilchrist has, of course, the bicameral mind. So one mind, the emissary, is paying close attention to the knitting down below, and the master is looking around. It's like one eye looking around, head on a swivel, and the other, so we should have four eyes so we can look down and look around. But no, we have two. So we're always doing this. And, maybe I'm feeling with my hand so I can look around while I eat. And, you watch animals do this all the time. So you've got all of these competing tendencies that are going on. And so Laurie and Peterson, although they share vast networks, the ability to quantify how much network and how much background anyone shares is pretty much impossible. So they have a conversation, and this is part of what the Enlightenment got right, is the physical world creates a fairly durable commonality over which many groups that have competing worldviews can check one another and check how they're competing against each other. And I think that's been part of the reason for the success of Enlightenment civilizations for the last few hundred years. That is going away. And I don't think it's going to finally, Peterson calls it the, what does he call it? The counter-enlightenment. That's not a bad, I often sought the recession of modernity. It is a recalibration. And always when you have recalibrations, because we're limited, we need to sort of, let's preserve what we've achieved and let's sift and get rid of what we don't need. That's always an imperfect function. So we never do it right. And so again, we're all of this competition, all of these Darwinian influences, we're sort of working on this. We're trying to sift it because part of what we've seen in modernity is that it's not sifting very well. I love the first part of this video by Damian Walter because I think he nicely shows it.
A political thesis for your consideration that relates to an upcoming political event of some importance and to the wider sense of what the feck is going on this that I suspect most of us feel. The thesis is this: modernity is done. This doesn't mean the factories, shopping malls, the mechanized armies, and the mass media that modernity made are just going to poof, go away. Well, maybe the mass media. Newspapers and TV are definitely toast. But the promise of modernity, that we could logic our way out of every problem, build bigger and better machines, harvest efficiency gains, manage our human resources, that's done. The economics, the institutions, the politics and social formations of modernity are all played out and ready to retire. Whatever they could do for us, they've done. Now, modernity has been done for some time. We've been in the purgatory of post-modernity for around 3 decades, with one story ending and a new story yet to arrive. We're simply recycling old stories while we wait, rebooting movies and rehashing political narratives. But now, in 2024, things have hit a crunch point. Automation is automating so many jobs that the whole idea of work on which modernity was built seems to be over. And AI, when it isn't taking the jobs, is taking up the leisure activities we kind of hoped would occupy our time. Can AI make art? No. Can AI make what most people make when we try to make art? 100%. The internet has made knowledge free, and all the institutions that deal with knowledge, the media, schools, universities, etc., are looking kind of redundant. Is it a good idea in 2024 to send your kid to a school that conditions them for factory and office jobs that no longer exist? Was it ever a good idea? Infinite growth on a finite planet was always going to be modernity's Achilles heel. You only need climate change-driven shifts in the water cycle to crash crop yields 2 years running, and you have mass starvation. But modernity's narcissistic obsession with our own apocalypse is also not playing out as planned. The population bomb is actually population collapse, and peak oil is actually abundant renewable energy. Wherever you look, both the facts and the narrative of modernity are coming apart at the rivets. And the problem is that while automation, free knowledge, and abundant energy are all potential miracles, we're all so conditioned to the model of modernity that we have no clue what to do about any of it.
So I think that's a terrific summary of what we're talking about. So Peterson and Laurie finally find each other by sharing stories. And Peterson, who is a clinical psychologist, can deal with a story because he deals with people's stories all the time. He begins to explore Greg's story, and Greg begins to tell his story. And then finally they find each other. And finally you get some sense that the network and the backgrounds are finding each other, and things are starting to go, and things are going well. And especially when when Greg gets to the point of talking about the fact that he and his wife lost a son. I believe it was to a car accident. And that pain, and even though he's a Christian minister who had presided on many funerals, that this is a significant loss. And it tears you up. And even if you're religious. But then Laurie begins to get into the fact that he has a hope. And now this community that he has been living in, now this really begins to function. This really begins to function on all sorts of levels. Another one of the videos that I thought about doing was talking about the ways in which these John Vervaeke calls them legacy religions. What I think is going to happen is that once again, as has happened in decades and centuries before, these meaning crises that we go through are continual. Everyone is different from the one before, but more and more answers tend to fall along the lines of these legacy religions, even while they're competing. And all of the current changes are going to change those religions in significant ways, even if all of the people who are within them aren't perceiving the changes. Short on time. Again, I'm going to be short on time over the next couple of weeks. So I'll do what I can. And again, some of you if I do go to my mother's house, because there's a reason I have to go out east, family reason. People will be like, "Oh, then just don't make videos." Well, you don't understand. This is my meaning making. This is my processing this. I mean, I process this in the silence of my head, but I started making videos because I figured out that I can make meaning with you. I can create a community, even though it's a community online, and then I can have local chapters of it in real life that are even better, and I can bring all these people into a network. And I mean, this is obviously a deeply religious thing to do, even setting aside many of the propositional things, but to create a network like that is fundamentally what a religion is. Sharing the background, sharing the network, being able to, by virtue of, and this is, of course, the human superpower, by being able to collaborate and work together, we have all kinds of people in this funny little corner. We have post-Christians and post-Buddhists and Orthodox Christians and Catholic Christians and Unitarian Christians and Jews. Not a lot of Muslims, but we'll see if that changes. On and on and on and on and on and on we go. And I make these videos because I'm processing these things, and this is actually a disciplined part of my own self-making and my own strengthening and evolution and perfecting of my faith, while I'm also living in a local church community and pastoring in a local church community and working with people, the new friends that I've made on the internet and all of these things. And so I make videos not just because I need to put content onto YouTube. YouTube would be fine without me. It's because I want to, because it's fun, because you leave comments, because you write back, because you participate in live streams and on Discords, and you go to estuary meetings, and on and on and on and on. So, sorry for the little... I have a lot to say about what Peterson says about death here. Let's jump in there.
There's the afterlife, and I believe in the afterlife, and I believe in heaven, and I believe in it more than I've ever believed. I've always been a student of heaven as a Christian, and the Bible speaks so much of heaven, but when my son went to be there, I wanted to know more about it. And as you read the Bible, you realize that heaven is a real place for real people to do real things. Jesus said, "I go to prepare a place for you." And heaven in the Bible is pictured as a city. It's pictured as a country. It's pictured as a paradise. The Bible tells us we'll eat in heaven. We'll be reunited with loved ones in heaven. will be active, and then one day heaven comes to earth, and what we call the millennium, heaven and earth become one. So I believe very strongly in that. Now, can I prove it? Well,
What do you think that means? So let's
Okay, so yeah, and the reason this is a sticking point, where John Vervaeke pushed back on me in my recent conversation with Vervaeke and Peugeot. I really have to do a lot more thinking about that, because John's point is a strong one about the Enlightenment and dichotomies, and what Peterson is going to go after right here is very true, because Christians can say these words, and in our little community, those words sort of, even more than, let's say, in a large language model and the symbolic, mathematical, imagistic relationships between them, these words have emotional resonance, and these words have communal resonance. And, he said a few things in there, and so some of my little eschatological circuit breakers, because Christians are sort of all these little buckets. You can be post-mill, and you can be pre-mill, and you can be a-mill. And I come from an a-mill tradition. And he said, well, the millennium, okay, what do you mean by that millennium? So all those little circuit breakers tripping all the way down. But yet these things have functions in there, and these functions are not just, like people want to dismiss them, imaginary stories. We live in a world now that when people get anxious, we put them on pills, and those pills have side effects. And I was just looking up pills that someone I know is, they're undergoing stress. And so I looked up the names of these pills, and, these are benzodiazepines. It's like, I learned a little bit about those, just Jordan Peterson thing. And now it's kind of like, So you tell me what is better, putting a chemical in your body to somehow reroute your emotional system, or to live in a worldview that actually manages those emotions in a more productive way. Now, again, these are extremely complex conversations. What do you mean more productive? These are long, long conversations, and it's part of the reason why religions continue to evolve, people deconstruct, people convert, all of this stuff happens. People are negotiating all of these things, but to just simply sort of dismiss it by saying, that's all make-believe stuff, so you should stand over the grave of your loved ones and say, yeah, I don't know why I feel the way I do, but I'm just going to walk away. We're not going to have a ceremony or a ritual or anything, because even all this love stuff is an illusion. And all the way back to Jordan Peterson's Darwinian consciousness argument for the existence of God, this is God number one and God number two, that no, there's a reason all this stuff developed. There's a reason human beings have done this. There's a reason that religious groups have outcompeted. The thing that should keep atheists up at night is that, for the most part, for most of human history, there weren't many of them. It's not a good system. And one would argue that the further you go down that system, the more you fall into nihilism. And in fact, it's a lethal complex. Nihilism is. People kill themselves over it all the time. You're not going to be safe from it by social isolation or wearing a mask or getting a vaccine or going onto a ship and going away. Nihilism follows you, and it's deadly by your own hand. And so then suddenly people all over, part of the reason there's a new interest in religion is they're saying, well, you mean I might be happier, more productive, have more children, make more money, have better relationships with my family and with my neighbors, be a more generous, productive person if I, in fact, embrace one of these legacy religions? Well, it depends on which one. Depends on which circuit breaker all the down. Depends on which thing. But yes! Well, I believe in science. Well, why don't you look at the science about human beings? That science is clear. John Vervaeke, when we have our little debate-ish things or debate-ish moments, he'll regularly remind me, yeah, but the benefits of religion aren't necessarily isolated to one of the different circuit breakers all the way down. Yeah, that's a good point. So, yeah, you might as well be religious. But here's the thing. You can't really fool yourself about it, which goes back to Jordan's point, is let the man have his process. because he's got to convince himself, or at least get to a point where he's got to jump over the gap, or he gets thrown over the gap by a cancer or a miracle that saves a loved one from cancer.
Now, can I prove it? Well,
What do you think that means? So let's delve in. That's such a hard topic. Let's delve into that a little bit.
Yeah.
So Christ tells his followers to be perfect like his Father in heaven is perfect.
Yes.
And
Do I have time to really go through this video? Because right there, read the context. It's in the Sermon on the Mount. I mean, this is where in this video I really start getting into the weeds with these guys, because read the whole text with respect to what perfection is. And I don't think that perfection, as we think of it today, tends to be exactly what that text is pointing to. Because actually, the text says God sends the rain to fall on the just and the unjust. Be perfect, like your Father in heaven is perfect. You mean outrageously generous, even to those who don't necessarily agree with all of my circuit breakers? Seems to be what it's saying.
there's continuous injunctions in the Gospels to bring about the kingdom of heaven on earth.
Yeah.
That's
Bring about, you'll be my witnesses again. We're going way down in the circuit breakers here, and it's like, ooh, there's fruitful conversations here that actually bubble up, but I don't have time for them now.
central to the Lord's Prayer. And there's an idea that lurks in the opening chapters of Genesis about the reestablishment of the eternal Eden. And so it looks like, to me, there's an insistence that the goal of the true religious striver is to establish paradise on earth, something like that. And I mean, that can take some vicious utopian spins that are very counterproductive, but that's the underlying idea. Now, I don't know how to reconcile that with the idea of, so that's heaven. That's the heaven that people are striving to bring about when they aim upward properly and walk up Jacob's ladder. And I don't know how to reconcile that with notions of the afterlife with regard to death. We have the strange insistence on the part of Christianity, too, that Christ defeated death and evil.
Yeah.
In spite of the evidence that death and evil continue in this world unabated. And so that there's a paradox there. Like, how do you reconcile in your own mind the insistence that part of the Christian moral pattern is to perfect the world and to raise the material up to the heavenly with the notion of the afterlife and immortality? I know that's a terrible question, but
No, it's good.
I'd like to know your thoughts on it.
It's not a terrible question. It's a massive question. And the fact that you've got 15 minutes left.
Well, I think coming back to the statement of Jesus, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. Bottom line, nobody can be perfect. We fall short. So the point of that to me.
And mostly what he gives here is a pretty standard 20th century Reformed evangelical, which is exactly sort of where Calvary Chapel is in terms of that. And it's a good answer. It's my answer. I mean, it's my confessional answer. But part of the reason to talk to someone like Jordan and stretch you, and that's what real ministry does, is it stretches you. Because it's one thing to sit and think about these in terms of hypothetical answers. It's another thing to sit with someone who's just lost a son to a car accident. And I tried to send Jordan, I don't know if I have good contact information for Jordan. I know that his father used to go through his emails, and his father is now passed, and his mother is now passed. And of course, Jordan, with the illness of his daughter, the cancer and miraculous curing of his wife, the astounding pain of the akathisia that he endured. I mean, Jordan is in many ways sort of a Job-like character. And I understand all the circuit breakers, and certainly I've expressed frustration about things. And, frustration can be just because you want something good for someone, even someone you don't know or you have a parasocial relationship with. But we all gotta deal with these things honestly for ourselves. And in my experience, there's no shortcuts with it. And there's no point in fooling yourself or lying to yourself. You've got to go through that lonesome valley, as the old song says. And you've got to come to your answers. And your answers might not hit everybody else's circuit breakers. But you've got to have peace in your heart with your answers, because you got to live with yourself. So maybe this is a good place to stop, because But I love making these videos. These sitting and making the commentaries on the videos are a helpful discipline for me, because I listen to the videos when I, let's say, wake up earlier than my wife and, don't want to disturb her by getting up out of bed. And so I just listen quietly and I can focus on them, but I can't take notes or anything. But when I can sort of take them apart like this, it forces me in a more disciplined way to listen more carefully and interact and do the synthesis and all of that. So I've always made these videos for me. I've always made them for me. But anyway, what I was saying about Jordan is that, he just lost his mother, and he dedicated, I believe it's in the cover of the book. Yeah. To my recently deceased mother, Beverly Ann Peterson, who, like all of us, wrestled with God, she more happily than not. That's beautiful. That's beautiful. So, and pray for Jordan and his grief. He's, again, it's different grieving someone, but still his mother. And what tends to happen, the questions about our biases and our lived experiences cut both ways. I've told the story before that when I was working with Haitians in the Dominican Republic, I was once teaching an adult education class, and I had a room full of husband and wife groups, husbands and wives, who were sitting in a room in a little church out in a beautiful area, desperately poor people. And I just asked the question, how many of you have ever lost a child before the age of 5? Every hand in the room went up. Every hand. When we hear about it, that, someone that they lost a baby, maybe sudden infant death syndrome, or maybe some tragic accident or something like that, it takes our breath away, that how horrible that this child was lost. And, this month, 6 years ago, when my sister passed away, my sister, who was 16 months younger than I, died suddenly of a heart attack. Left husband, 3 young adult children. My father had passed away 5 years before that, but it was, it was way harder on my mother than the loss of her husband. And again, in that room, every hand went up. Those will bring people to ask hard questions about death and not play games with it, not play around with it, not live in really unhealthy dynamics of denial. But, as Greg Laurie talked about, and Glenn Laurie too, his life story. You're going to have to come to serious answers. And I know the same sun that melts wax hardens clay. Somebody in our own little corner, I think part of his bitter atheism is the loss of a loved one. Anyway, that's why I make videos. Leave a comment.